they ready or?
OK， 那个我们今天早上的那个第一堂那个讲座现在开始了。
Ready?
Yeah.
Okay. So I'm Bram I'm the general manager of Flanders Scientific, the global partner of Zhongjun, and what we're going to talk about today is basically the basics of color management and how that applies to our monitors in particular. So the fundamental thing to understand before we talk about anything else is that this entire industry is still what we call display referred. So when we talk about display referred, that means that essentially all the color decisions that we make along the way and all the color considerations that we're making are based around the monitor and how things are going to look on the monitor. So ideally, what will happen, as is illustrated here, is that from your edit to your grade to seeing it at home or seeing it in a theater, that if we make the correct displayed referred decisions along the way, that we'll have a consistent image. So when we don't make the correct decisions or we use monitors that aren't calibrated, this is basically the problem we get into, is that we have what appears to be an ideal workflow, and then because something went wrong in the pipeline, the end user, the customer, the viewer, doesn't see the same image that the colorist and the producer and the director intended. Okay, so one of the first kind of basic considerations in our displayed refer world is to make sure that we're operating at the right gamma setting. So any professional monitor is going to have, as part of its calibration, the gamma response calibrated. And gamma response is really nothing more than talking about the contrast response in the image. So here are some examples of common gamma responses. On the old Mac operating systems, you had a 1.8 gamma, and that actually was problematic because the rest of the world, the PC world, was using sRGB or a 2.2 gamma, so things looked different between those operating systems. Now, modern day Mac operating systems are 2.2, so at least there's a lot of consistency in kind of the computer realm, though not necessarily the video realm. So outside of the computer world, there's also a very well-defined digital cinema gamma standard, and that's 2.6. So every single thing you ever go see in a theater is operating with 2.6 gamma response. So amusingly, the area where we have the least standardization of gamma is probably in the area where it's most important, and that's in the professional video industry, where there is a lot of debate, even to this day, as to what the correct gamma to use is. So there are facilities using 2.2, there are facilities using 2.35, and there are facilities using 2.4. So why this is important is because when you have variations in gamma, you get images that look different. So it's kind of fundamentally problematic that we're not all using the same gamma response. So luckily, there's a relatively new recommendation called, I believe it's BT 1866. It's made by the ITU, and they are now suggesting that we use 2.4. So assuming that everybody buys into that and everybody uses 2.4, we're going to start having a lot more consistency in the professional broadcast market. So again, though, this is a little problematic in that a lot of facilities have been using 2.2 for a long time. So while there is this recommendation, a lot of people are not using it. But what I'm getting at and what I think is important is that you have consistency through your pipeline. So ideally, we would all be using the same, but at least the important thing is that within your facility that all your displays have the same gamma, and that if you're delivering something to a network, that you're operating in the same gamma that that network will be using. So if that network has decided to use 2.2 or 2.4, you should be using the same in your facility or in your work. So once you determine what the gamma response is that you're going to be using in your pipeline, in your workflow, this is where you set it on the monitor. And one of the great things about these monitors is that you don't have to recalibrate your display. On a lot of other monitors, from computer displays to other professional broadcast monitors, if you want to use a different gamma response, you have to recalibrate the entire thing. With us, we do all the math ahead of time and allow you to instantly switch to different gamma responses. So in a related note, we also have you'll hear this topic come up a lot, the difference between what we call linear or linearized oftentimes and log, which is really talking about gamma responses as well. So yesterday, Alexis did a very good presentation on log grading and kind of explained what log was, but as a short summary of that, log is a way of encoding on the capture side, on the camera side, a signal to capture a lot more dynamic range than it would otherwise be possible to capture within a standard Rec. 709 framework. So capturing log is great because it gives you the freedom to do a lot more in post-production. The problem with log is that if you have a camera like this C300 that only has one serial digital output and you're using external recorders and you have to output log, then your image looks like this to the director and to the producer on set, and they're going to go, what in the world is wrong with my picture? So what we built into the monitors is for a lot of different cameras. So we actually support S-Log, S-Log2, Canon log, and then we also support the Blackmagic designed cinema camera log. And we basically have what are inverse log monitoring modes. And another way to talk about that is basically we normalize the image. So what you'll have is the ability to go from something that looks a little bit washed out like this to something that is going to be less washed out. And where you'll see this especially is like in the reds here. Sorry, here we go. So you see that this color doesn't really pop. You add these and it does. Let me change the exposure on the camera a little bit.
所以你可以看到，我们在按了这个正常化画面的按钮之后呢，我们就可以看到这个本来像被冲洗过的这个比较色彩比较淡的这个画面，立马就变得非常有对比度了。
So with the corrections, we have two modes. So there's a standard mode and a full mode at all times, and to understand the difference is important. What we're doing in the full mode is we're not clipping any information. So we're taking that, whatever it is, if the camera has 13 stops of range like the cinema camera from Blackmagic, then we're cramming that into the available range that you might have in Rec. 709, depending on who you talk to, maybe 7 stops. So we're cramming all that in, we're normalizing it, but the thing that you're left with if you use the the full mode is a image that tends to be very dark overall. Sorry. So the image is dark when you do this, but it can be useful if you're dealing with very bright highlights, because in the full mode you will not clip anything, you don't lose any detail. So again, we do that for a number of different cameras. There's the standard mode does something different. It clips the highlights, but what it's going to do is it's going to give you a brighter image if you're shooting something that's just mid-tones with not a lot of highlights and you don't care about clipping the highlights. You get a slightly more pleasing image in the standard mode, which is why there's the option always to go full or standard with the log-in version. And you can really see the difference between them if you look in this area here. I'll do that now so that you can see it. What I'm going to do is I'm going to zoom in on this light because that's going to be the easiest way to see it. So this is the standard mode. Okay. So you can see that. So C-Log standard. So you see that in the standard mode you lose all this detail because we're preserving only what's in the lower end. And in the full mode, although you're left with a darker image overall, you see that you don't really clip any of the highlight information. You preserve the detail. So that's kind of how that works. I'll go to the next slide. Try not to make the mic go. All right, so another thing to talk about, of course, is actual calibration. So when everybody was using CRTs and we essentially had the same color gamut, same basic technology, you could get away with calibrating with just bars. That's not the case anymore. With an LCD monitor, I can make bars look perfect and every other level in the signal can be wrong. And so this is not effective anymore. So anybody who tells you that this is good enough for calibrating an LCD, it's just not true. You really need something more sophisticated. So the way to get accurate calibration these days is to use something more sophisticated, which is a 3D lookup table. And I'm going to jump to the next slide real quick to show you. Yeah, there you go. So what a lookup table does, there's a lot of complicated explanations, but the simple explanation for what a 3D LUT does is it takes you from one color space to another color space. And that is, in essence, all that a 3D LUT is doing for you. So how we utilize 3D lookup tables for calibration purposes is we are typically taking the native gamut of the monitor. So if the monitor can do maybe this type of coverage, but the Rec 709 or the HD video standard is this blue triangle, we're going from the larger color space to the smaller color space. And that's a phrase that we call carving out a color space, because you're taking something big and you're carving out a smaller subsection of it. So where you'll actually see the 3D lookup tables on the monitors is on the color management menu. You'll see these color space selections. And every single one of these color space selections is basically activating a 3D lookup table. So you have your SMPTE C LUT, your Rec 709 3D LUT, EBU, DCI P3. Those are all different set industry standard color spaces. And when you select these, you're turning on the lookup table that gets you to that color space accurately. So let's hit the next slide.
Next one.
So in order to create a lookup table, we have to go through some specific steps. And I'm going to be later today covering lightspace, which is one of the programs that we utilize to create these 3D lookup tables. But basically, the things that you need are a probe, which is a measuring device, an alignment system that can be either software or something that's integrated into the display. But what you need in the alignment system is basically something that generates test patches and takes measurements and is essentially characterizing the display. And once you have that characterization, we can use that information and create the appropriate 3D lookup tables. And then the last thing you need is you need a way to apply that LUT or to import it to the display so that it can actually be used. So you just need a way to apply the LUT. And the way that that works on these monitors is that we actually, on our menu, have this update CFE. And that's how you import a LUT. And CFE stands for Color Fidelity Engine. That's what manages or stores our 3D LUTs. So there's two ways you can do this. You can do it with standalone software that runs on a computer, or you can use our Direct Connect automatic alignment, where you just plug a probe directly into the back, set it in the front, and hit start. So there are a number of probes that work with the systems. We integrate with again, a lot of different probes, but there are basically two types of probes on the market: spectroradiometers and colorimeters. Colorimeters measure faster, spectroradiometers are more accurate, so we actually use a combination of both. So the workflow we use to get the best of both worlds is we use the more accurate colorimeters or spectroradiometers to align the less expensive colorimeters, and then we use the colorimeters to do the actual calibration. So we actually calibrate the probe too. Can you hit the next button?
Oh yeah.
So again, as I mentioned, what we'll be talking about later is the actual software that we utilize to generate the 3D lookup tables. And that's lightspace, which is a color management system. But I'll give a brief explanation of what lightspace does. So what we do is we put the monitor in a special mode that we call bypass 3D LUT. And what we're doing that when we do that is we're looking at the native color gamut. So the widest color gamut, widest color coverage that the monitor can do. Then we use lightspace running on a computer to run test signals to the monitor, different colors. We then, as part of that profile, lightspace is using an attached probe to measure those test patches and create a display characterization. So we basically figure out what the display does without any corrections applied. We profile it. So it's like taking a fingerprint. You figure out what the display really does by itself. So once we know what the display natively does, we then tell lightspace what color space we want to work in. So for example, we tell it we want to work in Rec 709. And when we do that, lightspace will build a lookup table for us that takes it from the wide gamut of the panel down to Rec 709. So then that is saved as a file that is then imported to the monitor. So we just connect a USB cable and save it to the monitor. So it's really as simple as that, but I will be actually covering that later today in detail. I'll actually be running the lightspace application and showing exactly how this works. So now that we've talked about that, I'll just cover a few additional things. Aside from color spaces, the monitor also has the ability to do things like select color temperature. Yeah. And then aside from color temperature, the monitor also has the ability to manually, and this is at a much simpler level than something like this, but to manually adjust gain and bias, and which also affects color temperature. So this can be effective if you don't have time to run the profile, which takes a while, and you just want to make a small change to the overall look of the monitor. That menu can be effective for that. So that's really about calibration. Now there's one other important thing to talk about, and that's that you can use lookup tables for something besides calibration. You can use it for what we call look LUTs or technical LUTs. So what a look LUT is it's basically, instead of profiling a panel and transforming to a color space, it does something more basic. It will go from like RE log C to Rec 709. And it's not considering the panel color gamut at all. So to explain it, I guess more simply, so you know that these log modes that we have here that we talked about earlier, the C log, S log, those are all just 1D LUTs, so they're very basic. The DIT LUT that you see on the color management menu, which is what I'm talking about, kind of does that same thing, but with a 3D LUT, which is much more accurate than just a 1D LUT. So this can be used for two main things, as I mentioned. So one of them is to kind of do the same thing as our 1D LUT, to go from log C to, let's say, Rec 709. And the beautiful thing about that is that because the monitor already has a Rec 709 setting, that's all done in software almost instantly. You don't need a probe at all. So the other thing you can do with this is that a DIT can use this on set to create a certain look, just a look that he likes. And then that LUT can be applied to the monitor to give someone an idea of maybe how it might look once it's color corrected in post-production. It's maybe a good way to think about it is an artistic LUT. So you want it to look kind of dark and gritty, and so you build this LUT that makes everything. It's an artistic 3D LUT is what it can be. So it can be either technical LUT or something that's more for artistic purposes. And so really, although that's a little bit of a complicated topic, the important thing is that the monitor has the ability to use lookup tables both for use by DITs and for use for calibration. And those are really two separate things, even though we call them 3D LUTs. There's really two different things going on. There's the DIT LUT and the calibration LUT. And the point is that we do both, and this is something relatively unique in monitors that are actually affordable, because usually you only find this in very, very expensive displays. So I think that's pretty much it. If anybody has questions, though, I'm happy to answer those.
有市场有什么问题？
就是想问一下那个 log 和那个 gamma 有区别吗？log 跟 gamma 对。What's the difference between log and gamma?
It's so log is it's usually a set value.
Okay.
So, or not, I'm sorry, gamma is usually a set value. So you just have a 2.4 curve or whatever. Log is actually just it's really not much different. It's just that when we talk about log, typically we're talking about an encoding. It's a way of encoding information contrast, just like gamma, and it's really no different. It's just when people say log, they're inferring something different than standard display gamma, and it's kind of a complicated thing. It's best to draw it out. So typically when someone's talking about log, you'll have something like an S curve, and when you're talking about standard gamma in terms of like 2.4 display gamma, you'll see curves that look like this and like this. So it's the difference between when we talk about gamma without qualifying it otherwise, what people usually are implying is something that ends up in a linearized result, and log is not linear. So it's really it's really an issue of just how people semantically use it, how they use the words. When someone's just saying 2.2 gamma, what they're usually referring to is something that ends up in a linear look like this, so that the camera captures like this, the display responds like this, and you end up with a linear response, and you get a normal looking image like this. When you're talking about log, it tends to be like this. So really, we can say linear gamma and log gamma. So when you ask what's the difference between log and gamma, there is none, because these are both gamma. It's just, are we talking about linear gamma or are we talking about log gamma? And it's just different encode or capture formats essentially. So, but what confuses everybody is that we say linear gamma, but you would think that linear gamma just means that we're dealing with 1.0, but we're not, because the camera's not capturing linear to light. So when we say linear, we're not really talking about the monitor responding linearly or the camera capturing linearly. What we're talking about is that they're both doing really non-linear capture, non-linear display, but the result ends up being linear because we cancel them out. And the best way to show that is if you can, I don't want to do it. Okay. So this graph, you know, it's true. What we're saying here, 2.4 broadcast, this is actually more like 0.045, something like that. And then the display is actually doing this. It's doing the exact opposite. And so the net result is a completely linear response in your image. And there's a really good explanation for why this ended up happening in the industry. Because you would think that the easy way to do this is to capture everything linear and display everything linear. The reason that ended up not happening is because on a CRT, if you fed a CRT, if you want to get 50% gray on a CRT, you couldn't just feed it 50% voltage because a CRT did not respond linearly. So the solution to that was to make the cameras capture in such a way that it ended up looking linear on the CRT. So long story short on this, what would have happened if LCD monitors had been invented first and become popular instead of CRTs? This whole industry would probably be different and everything would be characterized as linear. So all of this confusion is really the CRT's fault. Anybody else have a question? All right, well, Alexis will be up pretty soon, but if anybody thinks of anything else, feel free to come ask me. Thank you.
如果说大家还有什么问题的话，可以亲自来问我。然后接下去11点到12点就是 Alexis 的那个调色的那个讲座。好，谢谢。